The city was swallowed by the perpetual twilight cast by its monolithic skyscrapers. Yet for Elias Thorne, the real darkness was the persistent menace of those who never forgot a debt. The colossal sum he owed was not an abstract figure on a ledger. It was a tightening ligature around the neck of his younger sister, Lena. The syndicates did not deal in credit or time. They dealt in pain, and they had given Elias a clear ultimatum. Pay the debt, or Lena would become permanent collateral in some forgotten subterranean corner of the metropolis. Elias, an engineer whose reputation was ruined and whose future was dead, was now nothing more than a desperate debt hunter. His only remaining job, secured through a cryptic middleman whose voice rasped like rust, was night watchman at the Nexus storage facility. The Nexus lay deep beneath the ancient city, a wound excavated into the earth where the government and various arcane organizations had agreed to inter the incomprehensible entities, cursed concepts, fragments of divergent dimensions. As the heavy steel vault door slammed shut behind him, Elias felt as though he were stepping into a reversed world, where physics and logic were mere fairy tales. The air here was thick with ozone, sulfur, and ancient metal, a corrosive cocktail that burned his lungs. On his first night, Elias quickly understood that he could rely on none of the technical knowledge he had spent a lifetime acquiring. The Nexus storage facility was a technological irony. Security cameras, thermal sensors, and electronic locks were all installed, but they lay dormant, abandoned in useless decay. The actual maintenance system was a terrifying secret. The previous watchman had left behind a logbook, written in a shaky hand, detailing a series of archaic rituals. In this prison, the only things capable of keeping the contents inside were copper, lead, wrought iron keys, and thousands of sealing symbols etched deep into the stone. The steel doors do not lock them in, the journal read, the ink dry and faded. They only help you locate them. The protection lies in contrast. Lead soothes. Copper conducts the energy away. Iron inhibits translocation. And you must always listen for the grinding of metal. When that sound stops, it is already too late. Elias, a man who believed only in circuit boards and pressure gauges, had to force himself through the first task, inspecting and reactivating the sealing glyphs. He walked through the icy corridors, using a specific wax compound to reclarify the ancient runes on the damp stone slabs. Each symbol, painted with lead-infused chalk, was not merely decoration. They were mechanical switches holding reality in its proper shape. If a symbol faded, a small piece of reality could leak out. The sheer absurdity of the job intensified his fear. He was fighting the supernatural with tools from the Middle Ages, while his sister's life depended on him being a successful technical exorcist. During his initial patrol, having just completed the reactivation of the lead seals on the core of separation, the most volatile sector, Elias noticed an anomaly. The logbook had referenced a forbidden area not to be explored, locked by a copper padlock and a three-sided key. It was precisely this prohibition that compelled Elias. He gently tapped the cold brick wall with a hammer. He found a slight seam and pushed hard. The wall pivoted open, revealing a small, unlit chamber that was not on any of the facility's schematics. The subterranean exchange. The room was a bizarre blend of an old library and a clandestine pawnshop. Shelves sagged under the weight of crumbling, leather-bound manuscripts, and a heavy oak desk dominated the center of the space. Behind the desk was a spectral figure dressed in a faded, blue-gray military uniform with tarnished brass buttons. This was the proprietor. The proprietor did not move. He merely was. His face was etched with the fatigue of centuries of entrapment, his eyes holding a sharp awareness that knew every painful fissure in Elias's soul. "Welcome, Thorne," the proprietor said, his voice husky, as if he hadn't used his vocal cords in ages. "I have been expecting a man in need of assistance to call." Elias, though increasingly numb to the chaos of the Nexus, felt a chill run down his spine. He drew his rusty service revolver, a standard syndicate requirement, but the proprietor only offered a faint smile. Useless weapon, useless gear. The proprietor gestured toward the Nexus's defunct electronics through a gap in the wall. Here, only intention carries weight. And your intention, I understand, is to save your sister. The proprietor explained that Elias could not possibly fight both the Nexus and the syndicates with just a gun and lead candles. Elias needed a tool capable of local reality manipulation, something that could carve out a safe zone large enough for Lena and himself. The stability schematics. The proprietor pushed 3 brittle parchment scrolls, bound with thin copper wire, across the desk. Each schematic is a calculation thorn. Once activated, it can momentarily bend the physical rules around you, to protect, to escape, or to seal. You require 3 to complete what you need to do. And the price? Elias asked, his throat dry. The price is what imprisoned you here in the first place. Your truth. The proprietor smiled, devoid of warmth. To obtain the first schematic, you must surrender the most painful secret associated with your downfall, the ruin of your reputation and your life. I do not require money. I require what makes you, you. The proprietor sought to extract the pain, the remorse, and the secrets that had crushed Elias. It was a strange currency, but to Elias, it seemed the only way to escape the dual burden of the Nexus and the syndicates. After a drawn-out moment of silence, as Elias fought the instinct to protect the last remaining pieces of his self-respect, he gave in. He needed the schematic. I was ruined not because of a calculation error, but because I knew what would happen, Elias whispered, turning his gaze away. The overpass collapsed 2 years ago. I knew the design had a fatal flaw that the investors didn't want made public. I could have spoken up, warned them, saved those people, but I remained silent. I was afraid of losing my job, afraid of being dragged through court. I sold my integrity, letting innocent people die under the rubble, just to keep the hollow prestige of being an engineer. The horrifying truth spilled out, not as a normal confession, but as the raw stripping away of his deepest wound. As Elias finished, the room seemed to grow unnaturally still. The proprietor extended his hand, and a faint, gray wisp of smoke seemed to be drawn from Elias's chest cavity. That crushing sense of guilt, which had weighed him down for 2 years, suddenly felt lighter, almost empty. The proprietor did not take the memory, but he took its emotional weight. Good, the proprietor said, satisfied. The truth has been exchanged. This is the first stability schematic. He slid the parchment scroll toward Elias. It was hot to the touch, exuding a pungent scent of copper and ozone. Elias had officially begun the treacherous bargain. He had the first tool, but to acquire the remaining 2, he would have to delve even deeper into the darkest corners of his soul. He had sold a piece of his conscience to buy hope for his sister, and he knew this transaction had only just begun. Following the vile pact with the proprietor and securing the first stability schema, Elias settled into the new rhythm of the Nexus archive, a rhythm defined by dread and absolute precision. His initial daily duty was always to soothe the silent signal. Elias slid down to the deepest sublevels where the air was thick with ozone and ancient quartz dust. The sound control room contained no digital screens, only a wall crammed with tarnished gas gauges, mechanical frequency meters, and a collection of Cold War-era metal recording discs. His task was to find and calibrate the orphan frequency of the silent signal, an entity shaped like a child, sealed away after discovering how to turn abstract concepts into physical noise. He fitted a set of heavy headphones made of copper and lead, insulating him almost entirely from the outside world. The signal began. It was not a scream. It was a non-sound, a vacuum that the human brain desperately tried to fill with its own personalized terror. It started as a low groan at the basement frequency, just 10 millihertz. But if Elias slipped, it would quickly amplify into a supersonic shriek, strong enough to splinter bone and crack the protective sigils etched into the metal walls. Elias, once an engineer who could spot every machine error, now had to rely solely on acute sensation, slowly adjusting the spinning dials and twisting the manual calibration knobs. 33.456 megahertz. Hold, 33.456, he whispered, sweat pouring beneath his protective mask. Once, his hand shook from sheer exhaustion. The frequency wavered, and for a split second, the silent signal transformed into a torrent of painful information. A whisper that pierced the lead insulation, telling him how afraid his sister was, and how profoundly he had failed her. Elias gritted his teeth, forcing all his focus back to the technical task. He made himself ignore the horrific, nonsensical content, concentrating only on guiding the needle back to the precise mark. When the frequency stabilized, the silent signal retreated, leaving only a faint beep, a promise of return. Although the work was horrifying, Elias recognized something strange. In forcing the signal back into perfect equilibrium, he found a moment of strange serenity, a sense of purpose he had lost since the syndicates had destroyed him. The frequency ritual offered no rest. Next came the necessary confrontation with the Atlas, the entity anchoring the spatial gate. Atlas was no longer human but a mass of amber energy and distorted flesh, holding steady a spatial rupture capable of swallowing a city whole. Approaching Atlas required Elias to wear a heavy, full-body hazmat suit, as the area was saturated with distorting gamma radiation. He carried a bottle of gamma stabilizer, a glowing green liquid that smelled sharply of metal. It was poison masquerading as a life-saving tonic. As Elias neared Atlas's containment chamber, he saw the face of the previous night watchman, eternally trapped within the amber liquid. Atlas's eyes remained wide open, filled equally with gratitude and unspeakable pain. "Thorn, don't stop," Atlas's voice echoed, distorted by the transmutation. Administering the gamma stabilizer was not easy. First, Elias had to unseal a lead port packed with beeswax and protective symbols. Then, he had to use a massive syringe to pump the stabilizer directly into Atlas's energy core. This time, "Don't let it take root," Atlas moaned as the stabilizer began to seep in. This injection was harder than previous nights. As Elias administered the drug, he felt a wave of hot, filthy energy flow back through the suit, numbing his arm. The stabilizer was working slower, suggesting Atlas was either resisting or the spatial rupture was growing larger. Every night, the required dose increased, and so did the risk of contamination to Elias. When he withdrew the syringe, Elias caught sight of his face reflected in the visor. A faint, superficial radiation burn marked his cheek, a warning sign that the radiation had breached the protection. He was slowly becoming the thing he was trying to maintain. Yet, the proximity to Atlas's pain and sacrifice awakened something in Elias. Responsibility. He was no longer running from his consequences. He was the only one keeping others from this fate. Spiritually and physically depleted, Elias knew he needed the second stability schema to handle the rising pressure within the Nexus. He returned to the subtrade room. The proprietor waited, his old uniform flickering dimly beneath the weak green light. "You have performed well, new night watchman. The music of chaos has been tuned, and the grid has received its regular dose of poison," the proprietor said, his tone carrying subtle mockery. "But you are still burdened. The next schema requires a larger measure of shame." Elias braced his hands on the table, struggling to keep his breathing even. "Take it. I need the tool." The proprietor nodded. "Tell me about what happened at the Sonic Assault project. Not the excuse, but the truth that killed your career. The truth you hid from the syndicates, from your sister, and almost from yourself." Elias shuddered. The Sonic Assault project hadn't just cost him his job. It was the technical disaster for which he was blamed. But that was not the whole story. Elias took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice rasping. "I wasn't defeated by miscalculation. I was defeated by cowardice. When the overload parameters started screaming on the console, I knew it was going to breach and it would injure people. I had the option to hit the emergency system kill switch. He paused, the memory swirling. The alarms, the panic, his hand frozen above the red button. Instead of doing that, I locked the control room from the outside, claiming I had to call for technical support, and waited for the explosion. I didn't want to be implicated. I left a junior colleague, David, severely wounded. Afterward, I falsified the reports, placing the entire blame for the late lockdown on David, to save my hollow reputation. The proprietor listened in absolute silence. The phantom figure did not move, but his presence seemed to fill every corner of the room. Betrayal is not merely an act. It is the relinquishing of responsibility. This truth is exquisite. The proprietor murmured. You sold out a colleague to protect your wallet and your ego. A glorious secret. A cold shiver ran down Elias's spine. He felt as though he had been stripped of the last remnants of his humanity. The proprietor extended his hand, and on the worn table, the second stability schema appeared. It was etched in an unknown alloy, more intricate than the first, radiating a logical chill. This is the density reinforcement schema. It will help you patch the physical ruptures caused by the silent signal. Enjoy your tool, Gatekeeper. But remember, the more you have to protect, the more you have to lose. With both schemas in hand, Elias returned to his chamber, feeling heavier. He had the tools to survive, but the price was that every part of his soul had been purchased and stored in the proprietor's vaults. He knew he had only one more night to endure before he faced the final, most dreadful secret to complete the triad. Returning to his next shift, Elias noticed the atmosphere in the Nexus had shifted. The fragile stability he fought to maintain was fracturing. The physical pressure from the dissociation core, the prison of the conduit, had begun to warp the systems. The conduit was the greatest danger. It was neither energy nor sound, but a collective, non-perceiving will of chaos capable of bending the laws of physics by its sheer presence. Elias proceeded to the dissociation core. This was the most heavily protected sector. A thick lead chamber sealed by thousands of ancient symbols carved in lead and mercury. He switched on the old X-ray monitor. On the screen, the intensity of the radiation and chaotic energy, the chaos index, had spiked to 98%. The X-ray tracing of the lead and ritualistic seals began flashing bright red. This was the emergency signal. The seal was cracking. If the dissociation core fractured, the conduit would escape. Elias was forced to use the second stability schema immediately. He extracted a portion of material from the schema plate, creating a lead and mercury paste mixture according to the ritualistic instructions he had learned. He had to use his hands to directly repair the fissures in the protective seal. While performing the patching ritual, he sensed the frigid revulsion of the conduit. It emitted no sound, yet it created a crushing vacuum, a pressure that wanted to implode his mind. The metal cracks almost sucked the heat out of the room. Finally, after hours of tense labor, the chaos index dropped to 85%. The seal was temporarily patched, but Elias knew this was only a stalling tactic. He needed the third stability schema, the tool that might decide his survival and that of his sister. Just as he let out a sigh of relief, a faint beep sounded from the communication device he had secretly salvaged after the syndicates seized his equipment. A deep, cold voice cut through. Asterisk. We know what game you are playing, Thorn. We will allow you to finish your dirty work. But when you step out, remember we are waiting. Do not delay your debt. Asterisk. The syndicates were watching him. They had accepted the Nexus risk only because they knew he was the only one who could maintain it. Elias realized that it was not only the conduit that threatened him, but the outside world too. He needed the final schema now. Elias was no longer a newcomer. He was an obsessed coordinator, eyes sunken from sleeplessness but sharp with the brutal clarity of survival. He was accustomed to the smell of hot lead, the ultrasonic whine, and the icy dread of his proximity to the Atlas. Yet, these new habits offered no defense against the awakening of the most powerful entity imprisoned within the conduit. The conduit's presence was unlike the mute signal or the distortion of the Atlas. It was a conceptual suppression. It produced no noise, but instead generated an excessive silence, an emptiness Elias felt in his marrow, a sense that fundamental physical laws were being warped just feet away. On the seventh night, Elias was attempting to calibrate an aging phonograph disc to appease the mute signal when the entire control room plunged into a frigid moment of weightlessness. The fluorescent lights flickered, then died, even though the main power grid remained active. Elias felt his blood run cold. He knew immediately this was no ordinary system failure. It was the conduit. He raced to the core containment chamber. The room was lined with the thickest defenses. A carbon steel shell interspersed with lead imbued with ancient rituals. On the vintage control panel, the X-ray gauge, a measure of chaotic energy leakage, began to flash a searing red. The intensity increased exponentially, tearing past the safety threshold. Through the thermal camera monitor, Elias saw it clearly. Right in the heart of the seal, a faint fissure began to form, like a fragile web of light. If the seal broke, the conduit's primordial energy would rip through the Nexus facility and spill into the world outside. The conduit's chaos forced Elias to act on instinct, fusing the engineering skill of a complex systems designer with the ritualistic madness of a gatekeeper. He activated the Emergency Response System, ERS, a series of long-neglected ritual fluid conduits. Elias grabbed an old shovel and a bucket of consecrated lodestone dust, a sealing material the proprietor once described as the adhesive between dimensions. Sweat beaded under his protective mask as he climbed the metal scaffolding leading to the primary rupture point. He had to perform a manual override, pumping molten lead and copper forged with ancient sealing sigils into the expanding microfissures on the core's surface. Each touch of the irradiated barrier sent a jolt through his body. Gamma radiation mixed with warped spatial energy. It was a pain that pierced bone and spirit simultaneously, yet he could not stop. Not now, Elias snarled, simultaneously closing a pressurized gas valve and pouring the lodestone dust into the glowing crack. His technical knowledge saved him, showing him exactly where to apply pressure. The Nexus's old rituals gave him the tools to fill the voids that science could not explain. After nearly 2 hours of wrestling in the oxygen-deprived, radioactive environment, the X-ray gauge dropped to a temporary stability. The fissure was patched, but it was a flimsy bandage on a mortal wound. Elias knew the containment core was severely compromised. He was out of resources and out of time. There was only one path left before catastrophe struck. The third locus stabilization scheme. Elias returned to the subterranean exchange chamber. This time, there was no hesitation or confusion in his posture. Desperation had honed him into a sharp blade, focused solely on one goal: protecting his sister, whatever the cost. The proprietor stood there, the ghost in the threadbare uniform, seemingly waiting. He said nothing, only offered a cryptic smile, his gaze piercing Elias's soul. "I need the last one," Elias rasped, skipping all formalities. "The third locus stabilization scheme. I have done what you asked. I've cleaned up your mess. I've fed the Atlas. I've soothed the mute signal. Now it's your turn." The proprietor nodded slowly, a skeletal hand tracing the cold stone tabletop. "Balance must be maintained, Elias Thorne. You require the energy to bend reality strong enough to pull one life out of the Syndicate's grasp. That requires ultimate truth. The previous 2 schemes were traded for professional honor and deception. This third one demands your soul." He leaned in, his sightless eyes registering Elias's tremors. "Tell me, Elias, the most terrible truth. The truth that prevented you from protecting her, not now but in the past. The truth that convinces you that you are a failure and undeserving of rescue." Elias did not resist this time. He did not bargain. He knew this was the moment when all self-deception had to collapse. He swallowed hard, the taste of lead and radiation still in his throat. He stared into the void where the proprietor's face should be. She, my sister. I should have protected her from our father. I should have taken her away sooner, when I still had a voice, when I still had money. Elias confessed, his voice breaking, but forcing himself onward. But I didn't. I was too consumed by my engineering career, by achieving the recognition I believed I deserved. I prioritized my career over her safety. I thought I could earn more money, and then swoop in heroically to save her. I was wrong. I let professional arrogance and selfishness overshadow my real responsibility. Elias had traded his professionalism, Scheme 1, his honesty, Scheme 2, and now his deepest remorse, the admission of his primal guilt, the failure of a brother. No sound or flash occurred, but the proprietor seemed to absorb the truth. A cold satisfaction passed through him. "Excellent, Elias Thorne," the proprietor whispered. "You have tied yourself to this place with every fiber, but you have paid in full." A third locus stabilization scheme, etched in cold bismuth alloy, materialized on the table. Elias seized it instantly, feeling the reality-bending power surge into his hand. He had the tools he needed. Elias returned to the main control room, preparing to activate the escape ritual. He placed the 3 locus stabilization schemes onto the vintage console. The job was done. He could escape, settle his debt, and lead his sister to safety. But just then, the internal comm system crackled with static. It was a channel he had never heard before, not the hum of the Nexus, but an external radio frequency. *CRZZZT. Thorne? Elias Thorne. *CRZZZT*. It was the cold, emotionless voice of a syndicate operator, a voice Elias had only ever heard on a phone line. The syndicates had tracked him. "We know where you are." The voice resonated through the distorted speaker. "That cold pit. You've performed your duties admirably, Elias. The maintenance is complete. You have balanced reality beautifully." Elias felt his stomach clench. Balanced? They had been watching him? "We are waiting for you topside. Bring the money out. And don't worry about that little hole underground. We'll be down to clean it up after you leave." The message was an unmistakable threat. Elias gripped the 3 schemes tightly. The syndicate didn't just want his money. They knew about the Nexus facility. And the most terrifying part, they praised his work. He had completed his task and was free to flee. But in that very instant, the core containment reacted to the external disturbance. His recently patched X-ray gauge began to flash wildly. The presence of the syndicate, their intent, was exciting the conduit. Elias stared at the communication device. He wasn't just hired labor, he was a pawn in a far larger scheme. He realized his departure wasn't the solution, but the signal for the syndicate to act. They had used him to destabilize the Nexus. Immediately afterward, a dreadful sound echoed. Not the ultrasonic whine, but the rending of metal, the sound of the X-ray line finally shattering. The containment core had been breached. The conduit was escaping. Elias Thorne stood in the subterranean exchange chamber. The 3 stability schematics lay on the worn table, casting a faint glow like 3 bronze talismans inscribed with complex runes. He felt an exhaustion that had crested into a fragile sense of euphoria. He had done it. He had paid the price, in both currency and soul, to secure the tools necessary to protect his sister. Though the syndicates had sent chilling messages that they were waiting, Elias believed these schematics would allow him and his sister to vanish untraceable, beyond their reach. Yet, the ancient caution of the disgraced engineer urged him toward one final check. He needed to pinpoint the syndicate's team location and their exact plans for this final meeting. He retreated to the control room not to adjust the silent signal, but to utilize the crude communication system he had salvaged and refined in the early days. It intercepted not only the high-frequency traffic of the Nexus containment facility but also the low, often ignored frequencies of the outer world. He adjusted an old recording spool he typically used to eavesdrop on the syndicate's casual threats. At first, it was the familiar murmur of low-level operatives discussing money and logistics. Then, the voice of a high-ranking commander cut through, sharp and bone-chillingly clear. "No need to worry about maintaining the seals. Thorn has done our work for us." His patches were never meant to reinforce. They were designed to gradually weaken the anchor points. He is a good repairman, but a collapsed engineer, perfect for degrading a structure without knowing it. Elias froze. The chilling sensation was not the damp air of the bunker, but the vile truth sinking into his skin. The syndicate's subsequent words tore away every last shred of Elias's illusion. His nightly watch had not been a task of mere maintenance. It had been an act of deliberate sabotage. The separation core is nearly ready. Elias Thorn, the man ruined by technical recklessness, has performed every necessary ritual, each patch a fracture in the secondary defenses. We require the power. We require the conduit. Once it leaks, we will control a source of energy unmatched, and his debt becomes meaningless. Everything he had done, the risk of exposure to the gamma stabilizer to maintain the Atlas, the crushing stress of listening to and soothing the silent signal, and especially the delicate, technical, and ritualistic patching of the separation core learned from the proprietor, all of it had been part of a grander plan. The syndicates didn't want to prevent the chaos. They wanted to harvest it. They had weaponized his need and his guilt. He was not the gatekeeper, he was the unwitting key. Elias looked down at the 3 stability schematics in his hand. They were not tools of salvation. They were the fee he had paid for his own blindness. The proprietor had not betrayed him. He had kept his exact commitment. Tools for secrets. He had never said those tools would be used for the purpose Elias believed. The proprietor was merely a traitor, and Elias had traded his very life and honor. The resulting fury was not an explosion but a cold, dense compression. He had dealt with eldritch entities, yet the deceit of man was the most horrifying thing of all. They hadn't just wanted his money. They wanted to destroy the world and saddle him with the responsibility. At that moment, the Nexus containment facility reacted to the bare truth. The alarm bells, silent for so long, began to chime. It was not an electronic sound. It was the clang of brass against lead, the wailing of the very ritual seals crumbling. Elias didn't need to check the monitors. He heard the supersonic shriek the silent signal made when agitated. But this time, it was not a cry of pain. It was a shriek of existential terror, being torn apart. He sprinted toward the separation core. The warning lights, previously a cautious amber, had turned a frantic, blazing red. Radiation levels spiked. The dosage of gamma stabilizer he had injected into the Atlas last night was now useless. The Atlas, the spatial anchor, was screaming in agony, its warped mass of energy violently vibrating. When Elias reached the observation window, the sight inside choked him. The X-ray delineation, the layer of lead, copper, and protective sigils that had held the conduit for centuries, was ripped open. It had not shattered. It had disintegrated, turning into supernatural dust and base matter. Through the rupture, the conduit leaked into the world. The conduit was not a conventionally shaped monster. It was light too bright to be seen, an intensity of pure energy, a transspatial noise generated by absence. It was primordial chaos, ready to flood reality. The separation core had become a vast tear, and anything that touched it was absorbed, distorted, or completely erased. Elias knew if the conduit fully escaped, it would not only obliterate the city where his sister was sheltered, but also grant the syndicates the power to rewrite the rules of reality itself. Elias Thorn stood at the epicenter of the chaos, the 3 stability schematics tight in his hand. He had 2 choices, and both demanded total sacrifice. The first choice: save himself. He could activate the stability schematics exactly as the proprietor had instructed. A set of personal rituals that would create a tiny, hyperstable reality bubble around himself and his sister. They would be excised from space and time for a moment long enough to flee the reach of the syndicates. This was the planned escape route, the path he had paid for with his secrets and his honor. If he did this, he would live. His sister would be safe from the syndicates. But the conduit would swallow the Nexus, releasing uncontrolled power into the world. The silent signal would be crushed, the Atlas would permanently dissolve, and his sin against humanity would be 1,000 times greater than the engineering disgrace he had suffered years ago. The second choice: fix the world. He could use all three stability schematics simultaneously, not for personal escape, but to create a stabilization lock onto the crumbling separation core itself. This would be the final act of a true engineer, using supernatural technology to mend the catastrophe he had unwittingly caused. This action would stop the conduit. It would seal the Nexus permanently, denying the syndicates access to the chaotic power source. However, pushing back the immense reality-warping energy of the conduit required an anchor. When the schematics were activated, they would lock the separation core, and they would lock in anyone manipulating them. Elias would be trapped. He would seal himself within this prison, unable to contact or protect his sister directly ever again. He looked at the spatial tear, where blinding light and unbearable noise poured forth. He remembered the silent signal, the imprisoned child he had learned to tend and protect. He remembered the promise he had broken, never to leave his sister alone again. Elias Thorne realized that, as the disgraced engineer, he had made the ultimate mistake, and the only way to atone was to become the very building material of the sealing wall. He tightened his grip on the three stability schematics. The rage at the betrayal now channeled into cold resolve. He would not let the syndicates win. He would not let the conduit destroy the world. Elias, the last watchman, began to prepare the ritual. Not for escape but for offering. Elias Thorne carried the impossible weight of the syndicate's debt and the direct threat to his sister's safety. This burden was the leverage that landed him the final, desperate job: night watchman at the Nexus storage facility. This subterranean complex was no ordinary archive. It was a prison for concepts and entities that reality itself had rejected. His first night was a brutal education in survival. The rules were ancient and physical. Electronic security was worse than useless. Only old rituals, crafted in lead, bronze, and etched sigils, held anything inside. During his initial patrol, deep within the humid chill of the sublevels, he stumbled upon the subterranean exchange and its inhabitant, the proprietor. A spectral figure cloaked in tattered military fatigues, the proprietor offered a deal: 3 stabilizing schematics, artifacts capable of bending localized reality to facilitate an escape or ensure his sister's protection. In exchange for each schematic, Elias had to surrender his most painful personal secret. Elias, tasting the bitter need for escape, reluctantly laid bare the first truth, the reason his reputation as an engineer was ruined, and claimed the first schematic, initiating a pact more dangerous than the syndicates themselves. The subsequent nights dragged Elias into an exhausting loop of escalating tension. His job transcended simple maintenance. He was the conductor of a delicate balance between 4 warring attempts at freedom. He battled directly with the silent signal. Every shift required him to sit in the cramped, antiquated control room, painstakingly calibrating ancient recording plates to listen to and soothe the entity's agonizing, meaningless frequency. A deviation of even 1 millihertz, and the silent signal would erupt into a mind-shattering supersonic shriek, stripping away his mental defenses and cracking the facility's physical barriers. Simultaneously, he struggled with the Atlas, the previous watchman, now a grotesquely distorted mass of energy acting as the anchor point for a spatial void. Administering a high dose of gamma stabilizer to the Atlas each night was a necessary, radioactive task. The stabilizer was both medicine and poison, locking the Atlas in place, but exposing Elias to dangerous levels of seepage. Under the constant strain, the sense of responsibility, a trait Elias thought he had purged with the ruin of his career, began to claw its way back into his heart. As Elias neared his goal, with only the third stabilizing schematic left to acquire, the structural pressure within the Nexus peaked. The sustained stress on the facility caused the strongest entity, the conduit, to stir. Elias faced sheer terror during an inspection of the separation core. The X-ray seal, the layered lead and ancient ritual bindings separating him from the conduit, began to flicker, signaling a critical rise in chaotic energy and radiation intensity. He was forced into a desperate, frantic series of maneuvers, applying his technical knowledge mixed with the ritualistic lore he had gleaned from the proprietor, managing to temporarily patch the fractured seal. Under this unbearable pressure, he returned to the proprietor. To earn the final schematic, he revealed his most horrific secret, the one detailing his ultimate failure to protect his sister in the past. This act emotionally tethered him completely to the subterranean prison, but the 3 schematics were now his. Just as he secured his tools, the syndicates delivered their final message. They knew exactly where he was, and they were waiting for him to step out with the money. Elias prepared to activate the stabilizing schematics, planning his final escape route to fulfill his promise. However, through a desperate cross-referencing of archived Nexus logs and eavesdropping on the syndicate's low-band radio chatter via the facility's archaic communication rig, a devastating truth slammed into him. His employment was not intended to prevent the chaos. It was meant to catalyze it. The syndicates had used him, the ruined, desperate engineer, to perform specific maintenance rituals that were, in fact, systematically weakening the final defenses of the separation core. Their true goal was to unleash and harvest the chaotic, reality-warping energy of the conduit. At that moment of sickening realization, the conduit began its breakout. The X-ray seal shattered completely, and a searing, non-Euclidean light, accompanied by space-rending noise, bled from the core. Elias stood at the critical juncture. Used the schematics to secure his own escape and protection, allowing the conduit to consume the world, including his sister, or use them to permanently seal the threat at the devastating cost of his own freedom. A furious inferno of rage and self-loathing burned in Elias's chest, stoked not by the syndicate's betrayal, but by his own blind utility. He had willingly become a tool for the very people he sought to escape. Gazing into the fractured separation core, where chaotic light bled into the corridor, Elias no longer saw a ransom resource, but a looming pestilence set to consume everything. He looked down at the 3 stabilizing schematics in his hand, heavy, lead-wrapped pieces of etched bronze that were no longer tickets to freedom, but ultimate weapons. The choice was agonizingly clear. Escape and know his sister would face the unleashed conduit and the exploiting syndicates unprotected, or sacrifice freedom to erect an impenetrable wall. The creeping sense of responsibility, once a monstrous burden, now became an iron anchor. He thought of the silent signal of the wretched Atlas, the souls trapped here whom he had unwillingly guarded. He would not abandon them, nor would he let the conduit become a commodity. Elias wasted no time. He knelt at the intersection of the 3 main corridors, the nexus point where the facility's conflicting energy flows converged. He spread the 3 schematics. The first, the secret of his ruined reputation, was oriented toward the separation core, meant to stabilize the physical structure. The second, the internal conflict of duty versus personal need, was aimed toward the facility exit, designed to sever the outside link. The third, the horrific truth concerning his sister, he gripped tightly, using it as a conduit for his own personalized anguish. "This is not stability," Elias muttered, his voice swallowed by the conduit's mounting roar. "This is isolation." He began to hammer the first schematic into the ancient flagstone floor, using his old bronze maintenance mallet as a ceremonial tool. The instant the bronze met the stone, a violent counterpulse threw him back. The etched symbols on the schematic began to glow with a sickly green light. This was the condensed energy of his confession, of his deepest shame. It was more than physical, it was emotional imprisonment. As the conduit's pressure intensified, pure energy, like storms of blinding light, began to erupt from the separation core. Elias fought against the shockwaves, his body shuddering under the strain. He lashed the second schematic to a lead-clad support column, creating a closed loop. Its purpose was to establish a space-time barrier, preventing the conduit's escape and blocking any ingress from the outside world. He activated the final schematic, the vessel of his most terrible truth. He clenched the metal tight, feeling its icy coldness seep into his flesh, as if draining his life force in exchange for pure energy. This was the ultimate sacrifice. Not money, not reputation, but the very possibility of reconnection with the world. The conduit's shriek reached its zenith, only to be answered immediately by a deep, wrenching groan from reality itself. The three schematics, linked by Elias's focused will, didn't merely patch the X-ray seal. They created a fundamental, new encoding for the entire Nexus storage facility. Every particle, every concept within the sublevels abruptly became heavier, stiller. The Nexus wasn't just sealed, it was permanently isolated. It was no longer on any map, nor physically linked to the outside world. The syndicates, waiting outside with their armored cars, would find only empty ground, or perhaps a complete, impenetrable void. The conduit was violently shoved back, its screams muffled into a distant whisper within the separation core. The cost, however, was immense. Elias felt the connection between the second schematic and his own nervous system. He wasn't just the implementer of the ritual. He had become part of it, a living anchor. He was trapped, forever. He collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath, saturated with the Atlas's radiation, the mental strain of the silent signal, and now the supercritical sealing energy coursing through his veins. He had protected his sister in the only way possible, by making the threat utterly inaccessible to both sides. A gentle shadow, like an old woolen blanket, descended over the sudden silence. The proprietor stepped out, not from the subterranean exchange, but from the wall directly behind Elias. His old military uniform was clean and immaculate, and for the first time Elias saw him smile, a look of profound understanding and approval. "Magnificent Thorn," the proprietor said, his voice like the rustle of old paper. "You didn't use them to bolt. You used them to build a wall." Elias struggled to stand, his body resisting. I sealed myself in." "Indeed." The proprietor nodded, gesturing toward the now silent separation core. "You used personal secret, personal pain, to create the most stable matter in the universe. Atonement. You have paid the full ransom for what you lost, not in currency, but in liberty." The proprietor stepped closer to Elias, reaching down and gently removing the ragged military coat he wore. He helped Elias to his feet. "I stood here once, Elias. I was the gatekeeper. This job doesn't end when you die. It ends when you find your replacement." The proprietor handed the heavy, lead and bronze-scented coat to Elias. "You protected this place. Now you are a part of it." Elias felt the weight of the garment, the weight of destiny. He was no longer motivated by debt or fear. He was defined by sacrifice. "The syndicates won't be able to touch the conduit now," Elias rasped, his voice raw but resolute. "And they won't be able to touch your sister either," the proprietor confirmed. "The outside world was a trap for you. This place is a prison, but also your salvation." The proprietor began to fade into the encroaching shadow, preparing for the rest that had been centuries coming. "It is your shift now, gatekeeper. I suggest you check the silent signal first. She tends to get agitated after major shifts like this." Elias Thorne, the new gatekeeper, stood alone in the ruined corridor of the Nexus storage facility. He exhaled slowly, realizing the fear was gone, replaced by a quiet, deep weariness. He adjusted the heavy coat. Though trapped, he was truly free. Free from the threat, free from the debt, free from the burden of his ruined name. Elias touched the cold stone wall, feeling the slow, steady pulse of the sealed Nexus. The work never ended. Elias began to shuffle toward the ancient control room. He had to recalibrate the old recording plates. He had to listen to the silent signal. Now, he was not just the watchman. He was the wall, the ritual, the secret that held everything, including himself, in the eternal dark.